What if your best friend told the world your life's work was a lie? 1952. A cold morning in Paris. Albert Camus, still basking in the philosophical glow of the rebel, opens Les Temps Modernes, the most influential journal of post-war France. His heart sinks. There it is, an article signed by Francis Janson, but backed, encouraged, and perhaps even sharpened by Jean-Paul Sartre himself, his old friend, his intellectual comrade. The piece doesn't just critique the rebel, it tears it apart, dismissing Camus as politically naive and morally detached. This wasn't a simple disagreement between two thinkers. It was a declaration of war, an intellectual and emotional break between two men who had walked side by side during the darkest hours of Nazi occupation, two men who had together reimagined freedom, resistance, and the role of the individual. But somewhere along the path, they diverged. Camus believed in the tragic dignity of man standing alone in an indifferent universe. Sartre believed in radical freedom and engagement, in taking up the burden of responsibility in a world without God. Today we explore how two brilliant minds, born of the same existential crisis, ended up on opposite shores, one staring into the silence of the absurd, the other shouting into the chaos of history. And by the end, perhaps you'll ask yourself, not just who was right, but what kind of freedom am I willing to bear? Albert Camus didn't begin with grand metaphysics. He began with sunlight and death. Born in French Algeria, surrounded by the harsh light of the Mediterranean and the shadow of poverty, Camus grew up in a world that was beautiful but brutal, vivid but unfair. This early contrast shaped everything he would later write. His sense of injustice wasn't theoretical, it was visceral. As a young journalist, Camus covered the suffering of the poor in Algeria. He saw how colonialism, like religion and ideology, could pretend to offer justice while deepening oppression. And yet, even amid this, he never turned to cynicism. Instead, he turned to clarity. Clarity for Camus was the only honest response to a world that pretends to make sense, but doesn't. This is where the absurd enters. The absurd, as Camus defines it in The Myth of Sisyphus, is not just chaos or randomness. It is the confrontation between the human mind, which thirsts for order, and a world that offers none. It's the silent scream that echoes when we ask, why? And the universe doesn't reply. For Camus, the absurd is born not from the world alone, but from our refusal to accept that the world is silent. And yet, Camus does not advocate despair. On the contrary, he believes that living with the absurd is the highest form of human dignity. The moment we stop demanding meaning and instead embrace our condition with awareness, we become free. Truly free, not because we can escape suffering, but because we can face it without illusion. His answer to the absurd is not suicide, not escapism, and not surrender to false hope. It is revolt. Not revolution with guns and flags, but internal rebellion, the act of saying, I will live anyway. In this light, Sisyphus becomes more than a myth. He becomes a model. Camus writes, the struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. In other words, it's not the goal that gives life meaning, but the act of pushing the stone, over and over, with eyes open. This idea permeates all of Camus' work, from The Stranger, where the protagonist accepts the indifference of the universe at the moment of his death, to The Plague, where doctors fight a hopeless epidemic not because they will win, but because it is right to resist. For Camus, meaning is not something you find. It is something you live in defiance of meaninglessness. And this quiet defiance, this lucid rebellion, is what makes a life truly human. But for Sartre, Camus didn't go far enough. To see the absurd and stop there, to live with it, but not rise against the systems that perpetuate it. That, to Sartre, was a philosophical and moral failure. Jean-Paul Sartre didn't start in the sun. He came from the gray streets of Paris, raised in the corridors of intellectual rigor, nourished on classical texts and existential doubt. If Camus's philosophy was shaped by nature and injustice, Sartre's was born from books and war, from the isolation of the individual mind and the crushing presence of history. And yet, Sartre also confronted the same truth Camus did, that there is no ultimate judge, no built-in moral compass. But rather than accept the absurd and live with it, Sartre chose to push through it. To him, the realization that there is no inherent meaning wasn't the end, it was the beginning of a freedom so vast it was terrifying. That's why he famously wrote, "Man is condemned to be free." Condemned, not because freedom is a punishment, but because it places the unbearable weight of responsibility on our shoulders. Every action you take, every path you walk, every truth you uphold or ignore, you chose it, and therefore you are responsible. There is no one to blame. No God, no fate, no biology. Just choice. And that freedom for Sartre must lead to engagement. In Existentialism is a Humanism, he explains that when you choose for yourself, you are choosing for all of humanity. That's the moral core of existentialism. You are responsible not just for your own life, but for the world your actions create. This is why Sartre rejected Camus' insistence on individual revolt as insufficient. Sartre saw injustice not as a metaphysical issue, but a political one. If the world is absurd and unjust, then it must be changed, not just endured. And this change requires getting involved in politics, in activism, in revolution if necessary. He wasn't naive about violence, but he believed that neutrality was worse. To witness oppression and choose purity to stay untainted was, in his view, a form of complicity. This is why Sartre supported causes that made many uncomfortable: Marxist uprisings, anti-colonial struggles, even the Cuban Revolution. Not because he agreed with every detail, but because he believed that taking sides, even flawed ones, was better than hiding behind philosophical distance. To Sartre, freedom meant action, and refusing to act when action is possible is to betray both your freedom and your fellow human beings. In the end, Sartre's existentialism was not about feeling lost. It was about feeling accountable. You are free, you are alone, and yet you are not exempt. And in this, Sartre drew a hard line between himself and Camus, a line that would become a fracture, then a wound, then a silence that lasted the rest of their lives. Their friendship had always been an unlikely one. Camus, the lyrical Algerian, drawn to light, clarity, and the Mediterranean. Sartre, the cerebral Parisian, drawn to complexity, contradiction, and dialectics. But after the war, they found themselves rising together as France's moral voices. They discussed Kafka, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche. They debated ethics over long walks and short drinks. They both rejected God, but still searched for something sacred in humanity. And then came The Rebel, Camus's philosophical exploration of revolution, violence, and the limits of justice. He argued that when rebellion turns into ideology, it betrays itself, that the murder of one innocent person in the name of utopia is the first crack in any revolution's soul. To Sartre, these were the words of a man who refused to get his hands dirty. The response, published in Les Temps Modernes, accused Camus of historical blindness. It was brutal, and Camus, already wounded by the political climate, was shattered. He wrote back, not just to defend his ideas, but to mourn the loss of something deeper: trust. He wrote, "I await with interest your reply, but even if it were made in friendship, it could only be a reply to this attack, and not a reconciliation." That reconciliation never came. They passed each other in the streets. They heard rumors about each other's health, each other's loneliness. But the silence between them remained unbroken until Camus' sudden death in a car crash in 1960. Some say Sartre wept when he heard. Others say he said nothing. But everyone agrees something irreplaceable was lost that day. This story isn't just about two dead French philosophers. It's about you, about how you choose to live in a world that may never give you answers. Camus' absurdism challenges you to resist without hope, to stand tall in the face of cosmic indifference, not because the world deserves it, but because you do. His vision is one of integrity, of inner resistance, of saying yes to life while still saying no to its injustices. Sartre's existentialism challenges you to own your freedom, radically, relentlessly. To act not because you know you'll win, but because not acting is a lie. To live as if your every choice creates the world anew, because it does. Camus gives us clarity. Sartre gives us fire. Camus says, be lucid, be kind, be defiant. Sartre says, be responsible, be committed, be free. And neither of them gives you easy answers, because in the end, they're asking you to do something terrifying, to live without excuses. What tore them apart wasn't just politics or ego, it was a deeper wound. The realization that even among those who search for truth, paths can diverge, that two people can look into the void and see entirely different things. Camus died at 46, with a manuscript in his bag and an unused train ticket in his coat. Sartre lived to 75, guiding revolutions, writing until blindness overtook him. But in their silence, between their letters, between their books, something endures, a tension that haunts all of us who seek meaning where there may be none. So ask yourself, are you willing to live as if Sisyphus is happy? Or will you bear the weight of radical freedom, like Sartre demands? Either way, the choice is yours. And as both Camus and Sartre knew, the choice is everything.